Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining today. My name is Jeremy Stoltzfus with RPI Consultants, and I will be discussing the file creation utility today. Just a little bit about myself. I am a principal tech consultant with RPI. I've got over 20 years of experience in the Infor Lawson space. Over 5 years of that implementing Infor Cloud Suite, and 7 years, almost 8 years now with RPI. Prior to joining RPI, I worked as a Lawson system administrator at a healthcare system in Pennsylvania where I live, and actually at another client site prior to that. So just a quick rundown of the agenda today and what we'll be talking about. So like I said, it's file creation utility, which is an interface development utility that's available in the Landmark applications. It was originally created for the GHR applications, but has since been also added into the finance and supply management module as well. So our agenda today is just to talk about a few of the key features of the utility. We'll walk through the basics of building a file and what that takes and all the different components. We'll walk through the process of actually generating the file, show you the steps involved with that. Go through a couple of tips and tricks, and then at the end there will be questions and answers available. All right, let's start with some of the key features. Okay, so why would we use the file creation utility? In the past, we've done process flows to generate files, querying data out, whether it's through transaction nodes or maybe you've gotten into doing API calls and formatting with JavaScript and all of those things, elements. The file creation utility is really intended and designed to be minimal coding. So we can really rapidly reduce the development time that it takes to generate some of these files. As an example, when customers come to me and say, okay, well, I need an interface and here's the file layout, a lot of times it's a minimum of 20 hours of work to get the process flow set up, getting your variables, getting your queries, and worrying about the formatting and the extra scripting that's required. This really reduces that development time. And for some of these basic, let's say like a basic employee demographic file, these can be generated in just a couple of hours, so 1 to 2 hours, depending on how complex it is. And that is because of the minimal coding that's required. And you can go obviously a lot more advanced and do a lot more complicated things that do increase that time. But because of the framework that's built in the file creation utility, it drastically reduces that development time. There are defined starting points that you use. So on the HR talent side, you have things such as the employee business class or work assignment or positions, jobs, things like that. You also have benefits. So these are this utility is very useful in generating benefit interface files, which are some of the more complicated files. And then you can take advantage of the application-defined relationships. So employee can have one or many work assignments, right? So you can use those relationships and report back and create files containing all of that data. Or maybe it's an employee with dependents, multiple dependents, that type of thing. So those are all of the relationships that are already built into the application, and the file creation utility takes advantage of those. Some of the other key features, right? We've got fixed length or CSV options. So you can define the specific separator if you're using a CSV option. So the default, of course, is a comma, but you can use a pipe, use a caret, whatever it is that you want to separate the data elements with. You can specify field delimiters, so you can have all your fields have quotes around the data in case there's commas in the data and you are using a comma separator. You can define and specify the end of line characters. So if you're moving to taking a file and putting that onto maybe a Unix platform where you need the carriage return end line feed characters, you can specify those things. And then you can also specify segment limits. So how big can the file be, and do you generate multiple files? And those options. With fixed length, as you're defining the fields, you basically say, okay, well, we've got the first column or the first field is 10 characters max, right? and the file creation utility will automatically cut that off. In the past, like if you're using IPA, for example, you would have to use some JavaScript to make sure that you only got the first 10 characters and you formatted it, and you had to do a lot more work. The file creation utility will do all of that just out of the box for you. If you say this column, this field is 10 characters in length, it will truncate after 10 characters. Parent-child relationships. So I mentioned an employee with dependents, right? So we've got that one-to-many relationship, and it keeps the child records all with the parent. So when you talk about benefit carrier files, for example, the first line you typically will send the employee, and then under that employee record, you have all of the dependents that are associated with that employee, and it sorts them and keeps them in the correct order. And then multiple record layouts. So what does that mean? Well, you can have header records with a completely different format than the main content of your file. You have footer records. Again, you can include counts, totals, those types of things. Different record types, even within the main body of your file that you're creating, right? So an employee dependent record that I keep referring to, the employee record may include a set of 20 fields, but the dependent may only need to include maybe 10 fields, right? So those are some different options, and you can create your selection criteria, define selection criteria to control which records get displayed and when. Another key feature that's really powerful, change file versus full file. So similar to how replication sets work, you can specify that your file creation utility setup is only going to include records that have changed since the last time. So similar to how replication sets run, they will keep and maintain using the audit log to track the date and time stamps of that last file that gets generated. You've got flexible record selection criteria, custom groups and subjects, very powerful, being able to write some complex selection criteria for your data that you want to pull back. And then you can actually even further refine that data at the record level. So I mentioned about having multiple record types in the same pulling using the same data. So maybe a single employee record might generate 3 different records in the file. And then depending on additional criteria, you can show or hide those various record layouts that might be required. There are sorting options as well. You can assign multiple levels of sorting and subtotaling as well. So subtotaling, and I mentioned counting as well. You can also additionally count records. You can specify multiple counts or multiple subtotal values within the file. Totals, as I was mentioning, multiple totals or counts. Formatting. So there is some additional formatting power that you have within here, within the utility. There, you can create some Java and regular expression formatting options. So, and out of the box, there are some GUI helpers to help you. So date formats being the biggest one, right? So sometimes it's month, day, year, sometimes it's year, month, day, sometimes it's a 6-digit date, sometimes it's an 8-digit date, all easily configurable on every specific field that might be a date field. Another formatting option is if you want to pad, so in a fixed length file, for example, you may want to pad a numeric value with leading zeros, and you can do all of that. And there's some, like I said, some GUI helpers that allow you to select different options, and it will automatically apply the format. The nice thing with some of the formatting options is there's a little preview, so you can actually put in some tests right on the formatting screen where you're specifying those. You put in some test data, and you can see how it will format. And then finally, post-file generation. So you've got a couple options here. So it's great, you can generate the file, but at the end of the day, that file needs to go somewhere. So you've got 2 options. You can trigger an IPA, and we can pick up that process or that file that gets generated and send it anywhere, right? So you've got the FTP node, of course, with an IPA that we can use to push that file out. There's also the ability to send the file directly to Ion, and then with Ion, you can do the same thing. You can do it FTP, or maybe you're sending it to another application directly. if you've got connection points set up to different applications where you can pass that file right along. So it does give you those options. Also within the IPA, just a little bit more power. Sometimes there's additional formatting or some additional data analysis that you need to do that can't be done in the file creation utility. So then you can basically read that file in. And I've done this several times where we'll generate a file, we'll pass it to IPA, we read that file, and we do additional more complex logic within IPA using JavaScript, which tends to process a lot quicker than if you were to do transaction nodes, looping through thousands of transactions and applying that format and writing a file. So what's the process? So how complicated is it? So I'm just gonna walk through kind of the basic steps of building a pretty basic file and give you an overview of some of the options that are available. And I kind of touched on some of these, but as we look here, we've got, you give it a file, a description, you specify this source file. So that source file is the set of business classes where you define as your starting point. On the HR side, there are a significant number here, especially around the employee, work assignment, benefit, business classes. There's a long list, and occasionally Infor will add additional business classes here as starting points. On the finance side, there aren't quite as many, but like I said, it is a little bit newer as a utility within the financials application. So I would expect some more just to be continually added as we go through, as time comes along. Specify the file name here, and you can optionally append a timestamp, and allows you to specify that timestamp format. If you know the Java syntax to format it, you can do it here. There is a builder, so if you check that little build timestamp format option, it gives you a little utility to kind of select a couple different options, whether to include century, timestamp, or just a date stamp type of thing. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. If you need to hard code the header of the file, so if it's the field names, for example, you would put that in that free text box there as well. So it gives you the ability to put that in there. The file attributes and processing tab just gives us a few more options here. This is where you would specify if it's a fixed length or a separated file, your end of line character, which I mentioned earlier, segment limits. So you can say, hey, after 10 meg, cut it off. This file is too big. Let's generate another file, so it'll create multiple files. One thing that's really powerful here is the threading method. So you can set these up to run in multiple threads. I've seen this in use at some very large clients, and they can, depending on the number of threads you have available in async, you can really split this up and allow it to really run efficiently. With some of the more recent updates that happened this year, there have been some significant improvements as far as the performance and how quickly those threads do the work to analyze and figure out what data to include. And then at the end, you can process all of those threads, merge all those threads back into one master file. So it takes however many threads you've got and just puts them all together, or you can have them separate, have separate files based on the number of threads. And I mentioned here the options, the output options. So once the file gets generated, what do you do with it? And so here's where you would specify the process flow service to trigger the process flow. And alternatively, you can send that file over to Ion and process it and handle it in Ion as well. As I mentioned previously, your record selection options, this is your eligibility group. This really gives you a lot of power and a lot of flexibility in selecting those records that need to come in. And when I talk about the process of actually generating a file, will explain this a little bit more, but typically you want to start with an eligibility group, especially if it's a subset of your data. So unless you're pulling all employees in every single record, you want to specify an eligibility group here because it's much more efficient to start with a smaller set of data. So for example, if you want active employees only, or in this example that I've got here, this is the eligibility group for terminated final employees, right? So only those that are in that term final status, bring those in. So that's a much smaller subset of data. Alternatively, and when we get into the row criteria, I'll show you, you can specify some additional criteria. Problem with that is if you don't specify an eligibility group, it wants to pull every single employee record in, and then it has to process each one to see if it matches the criteria, and that's just going to add a lot more time. That this eligibility selection criteria runs much more efficiently, starts with that smaller set of data, and then goes from there. And then you can see the last timestamp here. So this indicates the last time that this file was run, so that the next time I run this process for this specific file, it will only pick up records that have changed since this date and time. Alternatively, you can set the all records flag if your eligibility group clearly defines all of the records that you need. If you need to send a full file every time, that's when you would check that option to be on. This is where really the heart of the file creation utility exists. So you've got row detail and column detail. And this is what I mentioned earlier about you can have a header record and multiple record types. So for every record that meets your eligibility group criteria, it's going to evaluate against these different row types, these different record types. And a little bit more on that in a minute, but so you can see here, I've got a header record, and when I specified this as row type header, or the alternative is source file or trailer, that's going to be your footer. So the system will automatically put that header at the top and any trailers at the bottom. And yes, your headers can include counts or totals. And what it does is it just basically holds on and it writes that line out before, after it's all done and it's been able to calculate or count all of the records that are included. Then as you select each one of these row detail options, you can see the different columns that are associated with it. So each one of these rows can have different options of the, or different fields in that record. So this particular example is actually a fixed length file. So you can see here where my first field is 2 characters. So it's begins at 1 and goes to 2 and so forth. So it gives you that complete control. You've got your input option. You can see the source business class and your source fields, right? So that gives you that overview of what this row is. And so it allows you to quickly find something that you might be looking for if you need to change anything. If the source business class here in this example, there's a couple that are blank, that's because it's using the default. So if we go back to that first tab that we had, that setup detail, I had selected employee as my base business class. So that's going to be the fields that are from the employee business class if they don't specify one. And this is where I was saying, it's using the relationships, the application defined relationships out of the box, right? So primary work assignment, the employee identification number. So it's automatically linking those related business classes for you to be able to quickly and easily pull the data in. This is when we're looking at the row detail. This is where I was saying, okay, well, our row is going to be this source file, one to many header or trailer. A one to many I'll talk about here in a second, but our source file is basically looking at what did we define as our source business class? And in this case, it was employee. The linked rows, you can actually link rows together. So if you've got a definition of a row in another setup that's already got all of the fields and all the mappings and everything, and you've got something that's similar, you can actually link these 2 options together, or 2 rows together. Here's where you've got multiple count options. So for each one of these, I can specify up to 6 different counts. So whether it's counting a certain record type, so my example where I've had a header and 3 different row details, maybe I want to count a total of how many records in row 1, row type 2, row type 3. So it would check each one of those options on the specific rows, and then that way in my header I can call those out. This is, again, a little bit further on the row detail. This is where that row processing condition comes in. So in my example where I have a header and 3 row types, I only want where, so for record 1, I only want it if this condition matches. And so maybe it's a record 2 that gets processed for this employee record and not a record 1 or a record 3 or any combination of those. And so whatever you build out, you can use in that selection criteria. A lot of what I do is use derived fields that are basically a true false to do a little bit more complex logic. When you're building the conditions here, you can use you can define 2 conditions. So if it's got to be more complex than that, then I'll use a derived field on that business class to help me put the more complex logic in. So with any of these, such like with replication sets, or when you write a query with IPA or whatever, you can pull those user fields, user-defined fields, or derived fields to pull all of that. This is where the file creation utility becomes really powerful, right? Because you can create custom relationships even if you need to pull additional data in, or the derived fields, which might do a little bit more complex logic depending on the data and returning different values. So there's really a lot of control and flexibility. So you can be pretty simple with a straightforward employee demographic file, or you can, like I said, build some of these complex conditions and logic into these derived fields as well. And those derived fields can just return a blank if they're not even supposed to return any data. So this gives you that option. You can set your one-to-many. You've got one-to-many options here. So I mentioned the employee and dependent options, right, where you have that one-to-many relationship, and you can specify that one-to-many business class, and it'll keep all of those records together. When I get into now mapping a specific column, so I've selected I defined my row itself, and now I'm defining all of the fields or all the mappings that are on this column, right? I'm giving it a name. I can specify the order. I'm specifying the data type and whether this is required, or you can specify it's a blank field, or a hard-coded, a literal value. Sometimes that's the way to go. And then you can specify the source business class. So again, you would leave this blank if you're just using it as my starting point, like I said, was the employee business class in this example. So my source business class, I'm going to leave blank. But if I hit that drop down there, it would show me all of the related business classes that are part of the employee object. So that might be address, it might be identification number, it might be emergency contact, might be work assignment, those types of things. And so then once you do that, then you can specify those specific fields from that related business class, or again, because I'm leaving this blank, it's a field from the source business class, or the starting point. And here, because this is a fixed length file that I'm going through as an example, I specify my begin and my end position, and it tells me my final length and what that's going to be. This one does happen to be a date field. So you notice my begin and end gives me a length of 6. So what is that format? This is that Java formatting, the GUI builder that kind of helps you through that, so you don't have to know this syntax directly. And so it allows you to specify that. So right out of the gate, I can just select YYMMDD, and it's going to see here, you can see down here at the bottom, my test value and how it formats it. There's the option to include century. If I want to include a 4-digit year as opposed to a 2-digit year, I can specify a date separator if I want. And so I've got a bunch of options there. Depending on the data type of your field, you will see different formatting options here in the Java Format Builder. So for example, a numeric value will allow you to pad with leading zeros if you specify a length, and those types of things. With string values, that allows you to pad with spaces to a specific length, that type of thing. And then even within your specific column, you have the ability to do some basic data mapping. So for example, gender in the HR Talent application is stored as a numeric value, where 1 is undefined or unselected or not selected, 2 is female, and 3 is male. A lot of times when we're doing basic demographic files, they want an M or an F instead of a 2 or a 3. So some basic data mapping you can do here and specify, okay, whenever there's a 2 in the data, translate that to an F. And you can specify some default mapping so that if none of the criteria selected match, then it will apply a default value. With this, it is pretty basic here, but again, if you need to do anything more complicated, that's where I do the derived fields. And that gives you a lot more flexibility with whatever you can put into LPL to bring the data to the format that you need. Okay, so now that we've kind of talked through the very basics of putting together a file layout, let's just talk very briefly through the process of generating the file itself. As we look at the process, there's 3 main actions. So we're just going to call this generate preview records, and what that action is doing is it's going through and it's evaluating our custom group and pulling back all of the records that meet that selection criteria. Then as it processes, once it gets all of those records in, it actually stores the records in the file creation utility setup for that particular file. And you can see the date and time that it pulls those employees in, and when and whether it meets these row conditions, right? So the additional refinement of, okay, well, I've got record type 1, 2, or 3. In this example, maybe I'm pulling record 1 is only if it's a terminated employee. Record 2 is if it's an active employee, right? So a couple different options there, and the data looks a little bit different. So it's going to process all of those records and then determine, okay, does it meet, which row conditions does it meet? And then once it does that, at the end, it writes out the data file. So just kind of walking through, right? We want to make sure we activate the setup. When you first build this and set this up, this is going to be inactive, and so you have to turn it on essentially. The generate preview records action is what you see here. It's an instance action, and it kicks off that process. You've got an option here to generate the file automatically after creating the preview records. Most of the time when you're running this, you're going to schedule this generate preview records action, and you're going to have this turned on so that it automatically generates the file. Alternatively, if you wanted to first generate the preview records and then look at the results, that's going to be more for as you're testing it and looking at it. And testing your selection criteria, making sure it's pulling the appropriate records in, right? You can go to the screen where all the preview records are, and then you can see that they've been unprocessed, and then there's another action that you would run to actually generate the file. But when you've got this tested and it's running in production mode, you really just want to schedule the generate preview records action, and then you kick off and you select this option. That way it automatically does that. Once you do that, you can see then you get a list of files, and you can see the date and time that it was processed, and it gives you the file size. If you opened up one of those records, you would actually see the number of records. It gives you record counts and how many records it processed in that particular run. Especially useful if you're doing, like I said, change files where it's that file may be different each time. Just a few very basic tips and tricks, right? Just start with a few simple ones, right? Some of your employee demographic files, where it's employee name, address, phone number, right? and just to kind of get the feel of it and how they work and how it processes and what happens in async when you're running those. I mentioned this a couple of times, using derived fields for complex logic. So, the file creation utility is very powerful because you very quickly put things together and create those file layouts. But doing a lot of complex logic is really tricky within that utility. But that's what derived fields are for, right? And so we can build that LPL, we can build that complicated logic within there. Increase the number of threads. Default out of the box, the action is 2 threads. If you're a larger organization, you might want to bump that up to at least 4. I've worked with organizations that have about 10,000 employees, and 4 seems to be a pretty good number. It really just depends on the number of threads that are available in your async queue. And then there's a regenerate option. I didn't show this in the screenshot. This regenerate option is really useful when you're developing and you're testing your file. You need to make a change to the layout. Basically, you can you generate the file one time, you look at it, and there's a couple of things that aren't right. Instead of running the process or generate preview records where it has to go out and pull those records in, depending on how many records it is or how complex your selection criteria is, it could take a little bit to process. So this regenerate when you're testing is great because it already uses the preview records. So on the previous screen, I showed just there's only 2 files there, but you see the full history of all the files that get generated. You select the latest file and you click regenerate, and it'll reevaluate all of the mapping and give you that option and just generate the file as opposed to doing some of the other additional logic and whatnot. And that's basically it. So thank you very much for your time.